All right, well, welcome to the first ever new member class learning session that Bruce and I will be co-teaching. And so today we are going to focus all on United Methodist history. Now, as we kind of spoke about in the past, we're not going to cover everything at all. We're just going to try and give you some of the highlights so you might understand a little bit more about what this Methodist movement and in turn denomination is all about. As you can see, we have John Wesley in bobblehead form joining us today. And if you've never heard of John Wesley and his brother Charles have been kind of the two deemed as the founders of the Methodist movement. They would say maybe by accident. They never intended it, but we'll get into that in a little bit. You can see we have some terms here just to kind of highlight different people, places, and dates as well. And so we'll just use that to guide our time. And if you'd like to follow along or write notes, be sure to do that in the membership packet. So, the United Methodist history. So it began in England. The Church of England was the established religion at the time, which with this made the monarchy the head of the church. And again, it was the official religion. And so the time frame that we're kind of focusing on is the 18th and 19th century is kind of the era of the Wesleys. And so the Wesley family, the parents, matriarch and patriarch, were Samuel and Susanna. And Samuel, John and Charles's father, was Oxford educated. He was a minister in the Church of England. And Susanna, so at the time, women weren't allowed to be in formal education in any way, and yet it was super important for her to make sure all of her children, both the boys and the girls, were educated. And so she was tasked with this early education, and she herself was very well equipped and versed in her own education as well as her theological understandings. So she's pretty cool. But the parents of these two boys were very instrumental in kind of their own faith journey and self-understanding. And John and Charles were brothers who were very faithful and very inquisitive about their own faith. And the kind of beginning rumblings of this Methodist movement started in Oxford. And so at the time, Charles Wesley, John's brother, was there, and he wrote a letter to John basically saying, you know what, I am ready to combat like any lethargy I have. The school at the time was really invested in trying to kind of push off these understandings of deism. And so he asked Charles, or his brother, for advice. He said, you know, you are somebody I trust, and I would love to know what it means to live this life of holiness. And with that, John decided to go to Oxford, joining his brother and their friend William Morgan. This was in like 1729. And they really informally just met weekly together to pray, study, talk about religious conversations, and they would attend the sacrament regularly together. And that was one of their nicknames nickname in a bad way. People would kind of term them as sacramentarians because they'd always make the journey to take sacrament as often as they could. So anyways, this kind of evolved into a club of sorts. They had different tasks for each day of the week, had a very kind of Methodist way of living their life of holiness together. And so a really interesting part of this kind of club is it evolved over time. So it started very much with that personal kind of faith work and study, and then they eventually kind of looked outward and they started visiting those in prison, the elderly and the poor, and that became like a really key tenet of their weekly holy life together. So that's kind of the first movement of the rumblings of Methodism, the Oxford days. And then the second movement would be attributed to John and Charles Wesley's time as missionaries in Savannah, Georgia. And at best, this was a time of self-discovery, but a lot of people would say this time was not the highlight for either John or Charles. Charles left after 6 months because he got sick, and John stayed 2 years. His intention was to both save his soul and to do good by being missionaries to the Native Americans and the African Americans. And it was a failure in a lot of sense, in that he, even in his writings, you could tell that he had a pretty racist understanding towards Native Americans, African Americans, felt pretty down about the whole kind of missionary endeavor. But he would say, hindsight, that he grew a lot spiritually in that time. His time kind of came to an end because he was basically told that he was, I don't know how to say this well, but he was almost brought up on trial for charges that he, tisk tisk, right? So he would deny people communion because he was mad at them. There was a woman, Sophie, that he really liked, and he denied her communion because she rejected him. So he was in a season of discernment generally. So then he went back to London, and this was kind of his time of really clarifying what it meant to kind of live into this life of holiness. And so 2 things I'll say about that. So many might have heard of this moment of Aldersgate, at Aldersgate. And for Methodists, this is kind of a moment where we remember John Wesley's own conversion experience. Obviously, he lived a really faithful life up until then, as we would read. But for him, he was always struggling with this assurance of faith, where he wasn't feeling, that comfort or knowledge that, he was indeed saved by God. And so on May 24th, 1738, he visited St. Paul's Cathedral in London, saw this, beautiful building and music and all of that. And he left that service to attend a society meeting. And he was listening to the leader read from Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle Romans. And we can see in his journal he wrote, about 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So this was a very pivotal moment for John in his spiritual discernment, and he really felt that term, I felt my heart strangely warmed, is something that we as Methodists today kind of use to describe those conversion and holy moments in our own story. Last bit of information on my end is this kind of third rumbling of Methodism. And so in London, John had come back from Savannah, and he was invited to attend the Fetter Lane Society. And so in this society, it kind of gave a glimpse of what the early Methodist movement looked like. And so this movement, which started in 1739, had services in open air, had field preaching, which I know Bruce will get to in a sec. And they had basically these religious societies. Keep in mind, this was all termed within the Church of England. So this entire time, they are not claiming to be a rogue group. They are not saying they are anything but Anglican and a part of the Church of England. But something new is happening, is that what this movement is marked by. And so these societies were formed, and bands, one of our terms up here, bands were formed, which were small groups of about 5 to 10 people who had chosen to voluntarily band together for this intense spiritual nurture and support. And so they would do confession and prayer together, and they'd have spiritual growth and answer questions as a group. They were groups with, just women had a group, just men had a group. There were groups, some were married groups, some were single groups. And so they were marked in these different ways. And so the band was the heart of the society and the heart of the Methodist movement. And so I think that shows the beginning of the importance of lay leadership, because John and Charles and the founders of it all couldn't be all places at once. And so these bands really became led by the people themselves. They were leading one another and nurturing one another. And that was kind of the founding of what has turned into the Methodist denomination. And so Bruce is going to talk about how it jumped back to America.
And it jumped back to America because of the Revolution. 1776 is an important day in the history of the United States, of course. And we remember the Revolution, but the cry of the Revolution, the cry of the streets was, "Tory, go home." That meant monarchy, go home. That meant king and queen, go home. That meant anything related to the monarchy, go home. That meant Church of England, go home. So all of a sudden the Church of England had to go back to England. And what was left in the Church of England that was in the United States up until the Revolution were these Methodist societies that had formed in the colonies. And so therefore there were Methodists in the new United States, but no church. So Wesley was convinced, and he ordained persons to be in the leadership of the Methodist Church in America. In 1784, the first church born in America was given birth in Baltimore as the Methodist Church in America was formed. If the Revolution hadn't taken place, the Methodist societies would have continued to be a part of the Church of England before John Wesley died as a priest in the Church of England, not as a, quote, Methodist pastor. So the first date to remember is 1784, 8 years after 1776. The revolutionary spirit was still in good stead, and the United Methodist Church, the way we're organized, we'll deal with that in a couple weeks, is a reflection of how we're organized in the United States politically. But in this movement, from 1784 to 1840, the Methodist Church was the church of the new land. It grew literally by leaps and bounds as lay leadership was essential in England in the forming of societies. Lay preachers were formative in the early Methodist Church in America because ordained persons just were not that plentiful, but lay preachers were. And so there was tremendous growth from 1784 to 1840. It was the frontier church. Wesley preached outside. Lay persons would go into communities. Circuit riders, they were referred to. Wesley spread societies in England on horseback. The man slept, the man read on horseback, and so did the early circuit riders. But there was a haunting dilemma in America. That haunting dilemma was slavery. So in the 1840s, three things happened. Number one, the Methodist Church in America divided. There was a church in the North and a church in the South, and they were separate institutions. But also, there were branches of persons in the Methodist Church that were persons of color. And so they broke off from these two main denominations and formed the CME Church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So there was division in the 1840s. That division continued for 100 years. A Southern church and a Northern church. And after 100 years, in 1939, it was decided that the North and South Church would come together as a Methodist Episcopal Church. The CME Church, the AME Church stayed separated and are separated today. Same theology, same organizational pattern, but separate since the 1840s. But in 39, two groups got together, North and South. But one of the things that happened in 39 was the ministry among the black constituents in the church at that time were separated out, and a jurisdiction, a central jurisdiction, was formed. So we had the Methodist Episcopal Church united in 39, but separated within, as a racially separated component was created for black congregations and black clergy. That continued until 1968. So for 30 years, this separate central jurisdiction was formed. In 68, we merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church. That was a Brethren church really out of Europe, more out of Germany, that existed alongside the Methodist Church in America. And quite frankly, the two denominations were kissing cousins, had many similarities. It was rather a comfortable merger of a large Methodist church and a pretty small Evangelical United Brethren church. That became the United Methodist Church in 1968. The very important event happened that when persons saw this merger coming, they used that as leverage to get rid of the central jurisdiction. And so all of a sudden in 68, the black congregations, the black pastors became a part of the family of congregations and the family of clergy leading the United Methodist Church. Now the reason I have 76 out there was that there wasn't anything organizationally that happened in 76 in terms of our history. But every 4 years, the General Conference meets. First in 72, but crystallized in 76. A new separated component occurred in the denomination. And that's when a statement on human sexuality was introduced into the discipline of the church. And the statement reads, homosexuals, no less than heterosexuals, are persons of sacred worth who need the ministry and guidance of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of fellowship, which enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. Further, we insist that homosexuals are entitled to have their human civil rights ensured. I was in Portland at the General Conference, raising my hand for that statement. But then an amendment came from the floor, had not been considered in committee, and a statement that has created 40 years of tension in the church. And that is added, though we do not consider the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. That came off the floor. The argument was, if we don't include that, the Southern Baptists are going to eat our lunch and take all of our members. My hand, of course, maybe not of course, you don't know me that well, but my hand came down. I voted against the amendment, but the amendment carried in a very emotional vote, of which I, as one person in Portland, still am not convinced a count vote would have sustained that amendment. But the vote was made, the vote was recognized to be an affirmative to introduce this last statement that we will discover in 3 weeks how that is now in the process of being removed as we move forward. That's sort of how we got where we are.
So there it is. One thing I wanted to add is when this merger happened in 68, that was also when full clergy rights were extended to women. And so that's kind of an important part of our history as well. But we'll have more to talk about when we gather on Tuesday. But we invite you to ask some questions of yourself. What feels unclear? What do you want more information on? And we'll have some questions ready for y'all next Tuesday as we talk a little bit more about our United Methodist history. So thanks for watching.